Picture the scene, a storm-lashed winter night in January 1457, the year that would carve itself into England's history. Inside the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, the corridors echoed with a child's screams, though not a child being hurt, but a child being forced to give life. 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort lay upon a bed of blood-soaked linen, her body racked by convulsions that no girl so young should endure. The flickering glow of tallow candles painted her gaunt face in shadows, her auburn hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat. The midwives murmured Latin prayers, their eyes betraying the grim knowledge that both mother and child might be lost before dawn. Outside, the Atlantic wind howled across the cliffs, battering the fortress with a fury that seemed to echo Margaret's own torment. The danger was clear to all present. Margaret's hips were narrow, her bones not yet fully formed. The child within her was large and poorly positioned. More than one whispered that she would not survive the night. To attempt childbirth at 13 was to invite death, and yet, here she was trapped by dynastic necessity, her childhood stripped away by politics and duty. Her body had not finished growing, but the ambitions of men had already conscripted her into the battlefield of succession. Hour after hour, the chamber filled with the sounds of her agony. Herbs smouldered in iron dishes, filling the room with sharp fumes of rosemary and lavender, meant to calm nerves and ward off infection. Midwives tightened their grips on Margaret's trembling hands as wave after wave of pain consumed her. Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, paced the halls outside, listening to each muffled cry with a soldier's helplessness. The life of his dead brother's unborn child, his nephew was the fragile hope of their family line. The ordeal stretched through the night until Margaret's voice, once piercing, became little more than ragged gasps. The midwives exchanged urgent glances. To save the child, they would have to act even if it meant sacrificing the mother. But fate intervened with its own cruel mercy. At last, after 18 hours of labour, a cry split the chamber, not Margaret's this time, but that of a newborn. A frail, pale infant pulled into the world as his mother slipped toward unconsciousness. For one terrible moment, silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of the hearth fire. Then the baby wailed, thin, insistent, alive. That child was Henry Tudor, the boy who, against every expectation, would one day wear the crown of England as Henry VII. His birth was nothing short of miraculous. Margaret, torn and bleeding, barely clung to life. She could not lift her arms to hold him, but her eyes, fixed on his tiny face with desperate intensity, as if imprinting his existence upon her very soul. It was said later that she lost something irreparable in that chamber. The damage to her body was permanent. She would never bear another child. Yet through this single devastating birth, she secured the bloodline that would end the Wars of the Roses and forge a dynasty. Few in that moment would have believed it possible. To those present, it was simply the survival of a fragile child and his shattered mother clinging to life within the cold stone walls of a Welsh castle. But history would remember it differently. It would remember the bloodied bed of a girl mother as the unlikely cradle of a new age. The girl who nearly died giving birth in that cold chamber was no common maiden. Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the dangerous inheritance of royal blood. She was descended from John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster himself, the son of King Edward III. In theory, it was a lineage to be envied, a mark of nobility, prestige and proximity to the throne. But in the brutal chess game of 15th century England, such bloodlines could just as easily make you a pawn or a target. Margaret was born around May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, the cherished only daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. Her father was no minor lord. He commanded English forces in France during the closing years of the 100 Years' War. Yet when Margaret was only a year old, fate dealt her a wound that would shape her entire life. In 1444, her father was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was given as a fever, but whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed despair drove him to his own death after a humiliating military defeat. Others muttered about poison, that favourite suspect in every sudden noble passing. The truth may never be known, but what is certain is this: Margaret's father left behind a tarnished legacy and a child too young to understand the shadow it cast. In those days, the line between glory and ruin was razor thin. The English dream of dominion in France, won at great cost by Henry V, had crumbled in Beaufort's hands. Territories slipped away, soldiers deserted unpaid, and humiliation gnawed at him until some chroniclers suggest he could no longer bear it. If despair was his assassin, then Margaret's earliest inheritance was grief. Her mother, the Dowager Duchess, understood the peril of raising a daughter alone in such a ruthless world. Noble women were not measured by learning or virtue, but by the alliances their marriages could secure. Margaret's childhood then was not her own. From her earliest years, she was trained to be useful, to stitch, to pray, to smile demurely, skills that masked the grim truth that her fate would be sealed by men at the negotiating table. At 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the powerful Duke of Suffolk. It was a glittering match, binding together two towering houses. For a brief time, it must have seemed as though her future was secured. But in 15th century England, fortunes rose and fell with alarming speed. By 1450, Suffolk himself had fallen spectacularly accused of treason after negotiating the marriage of King Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou and surrendering French lands to the enemy. The people's outrage was so fierce that Suffolk never saw a trial. As he attempted to flee across the Channel, he was dragged from his ship by enemies, some say pirates, others political assassins, forced to kneel on the gunwale and butchered with a rusty sword. It took half a dozen blows to sever his head. The betrothal papers binding little Margaret to Suffolk's son became worthless scraps in the wake of that grisly death. The lesson was already clear. In this England, no promise lasted. No bond was sacred. Marriage contracts were not dreams of childhood, but weapons of statecraft broken or reforged as swiftly as the tides of fortune demanded. Margaret Beaufort, child of royal blood, had stepped onto the perilous stage of politics. And though she was still a girl playing in castle gardens, her name was already a bargaining chip in the power struggles of a realm teetering on the edge of civil war. If Margaret Beaufort learned early that alliances could vanish like mist, she also learned how quickly new ones could be forged. Her broken betrothal to John de la Pole was barely a memory before she was bound to another destiny, this time to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. The Tudors were not ancient nobility. They were, in truth, outsiders. Their patriarch, Owen Tudor, had been a Welsh courtier of modest standing, remembered as a handsome man who captured the heart of a queen. Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V, defied expectations by secretly marrying him, a scandal that infuriated the English nobility. From that union came Edmund and Jasper Tudor sons, legitimised only by Henry VI's favour. To some they were ambitious upstarts. To others they were living symbols of how dangerous royal bloodlines could mingle with ambition from unexpected places. By the mid-1450s, the kingdom was already sliding towards civil war. The roses of Lancaster and York sharpened their thorns against each other. In this charged atmosphere, Margaret's guardians saw her value not just as a wealthy heiress, but as a vessel for Lancastrian legitimacy. A match with Edmund Tudor would bind her fortune and her womb to the royal house itself. She was scarcely 12 when the marriage was arranged. 12, an age when most children would still be learning to read or chasing games in castle courtyards. But for Margaret, childhood had been a brief prelude. In the great hall of Pembroke Castle, beneath tapestries celebrating her Beaufort lineage, vows were spoken that she could hardly understand. Edmund, in his 20s, was already a man seasoned by war and politics. Margaret, barely into adolescence, was treated as though her youth were no obstacle. In the eyes of the court, she was a bride, a vessel, a promise of heirs yet unborn. The wedding was solemn, the prayers binding, and the union was consummated immediately. Such was the way of dynastic marriages. There was no waiting, no gentleness. In later years, Margaret never spoke of that night, but her body carried its scars forever. What should have been years of growth and learning were abruptly transformed into the weight of conjugal duty and the looming peril of childbirth. And yet, history would not grant her even the stability of a husband's protection for long. In 1456, only a year into their marriage, Edmund was sent to Wales to suppress Yorkist uprisings. It was a turbulent campaign marked by skirmishes and betrayals. That autumn, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. What followed remains cloaked in uncertainty. Officially, Edmund succumbed to the plague, a common, almost convenient explanation in the filth of medieval prisons. But whispers spread of poison of murder, disguised as disease of enemies, eager to extinguish a Tudor before his star could rise too high. Chroniclers noted the suspicious swiftness of his decline and the curious refusal of his captors to summon physicians. By November, the verdict was final. Edmund Tudor was dead. His young widow was left in Pembrokeshire, her belly already swollen with child. She was 13 years old, too young to be a wife, too young to be a mother, and far too young to be a widow. Yet, fate had placed her squarely in all three roles at once. The weight of grief, fear and survival fell upon her narrow shoulders. Margaret Beaufort, barely more than a girl, now stood at the crossroads of dynastic destiny, carrying within her the unborn child who might one day alter the course of England itself. When Edmund Tudor's death was confirmed in the late autumn of 1456, Margaret's world collapsed with a swiftness that left no time for mourning. She was only 13, a widow in name, but still a child in body, heavy with the burden of her first pregnancy. In the flickering chapel light at Lamphy Palace, where the news reached her, she fell to her knees in prayer, her lips whispering words she could scarcely believe would be answered. Outside, rain lashed the Welsh countryside, a fitting echo for her grief. The news struck her not only as a personal loss, but as a terrifying revelation. Edmund's death left her exposed. In a land riven by rebellion, a pregnant girl with vast inherited estates was as vulnerable as an unguarded fortress. Her late husband's younger brother, Jasper Tudor, stepped forward to claim the role of protector. But his guardianship was not mere compassion, it was necessity. Margaret carried the future of the Tudor line within her, and if anything happened to her or the child, all their ambitions would dissolve into ash. It is hard from the distance of centuries to grasp the isolation Margaret must have felt. Most girls her age were still playing with dolls carved of wood, their futures distant dreams. She was instead thrust into the brutal machinery of dynastic politics. To the men around her, her swollen belly was less a symbol of her suffering than of hope for a cause teetering on the edge of ruin. But the dangers were not only political. Margaret's own body threatened her life at every turn. Medieval physicians understood little of the perils of childbirth, but even they could see the risk in her narrow frame. She was not yet fully grown, her hips had not widened, her bones had not set. The physician who examined her confided darkly to Jasper Tudor that this pregnancy might kill her. Meanwhile, civil war drew closer with every passing week. The first open clash between the houses of Lancaster and York had erupted at St Albans in 1455, and the realm simmered with vengeance. Jasper knew Pembrokeshire was no safe haven, but it was the best he could offer. Margaret would be taken to the fortress of Pembroke Castle, its towering limestone walls, rising above the sea like a grim promise of protection. The journey itself was a trial. She was carried by litter over frozen, rutted roads, her body jolted and strained with every mile. The Welsh winter was unforgiving, mud-slick paths, swollen rivers, forests, prowled by armed men of uncertain allegiance. The cold bit into her skin each day, stretching longer than the last, until finally the great round keep of Pembroke loomed above the cliffs stark against the storm-tossed sky. Margaret had reached her place of confinement, but not of safety. The castle's stone walls could keep out enemies, but they could not shield her from the ordeal ahead. Already weakened by grief, worn down by the journey, she now faced the most harrowing trial of all, the birth of a child, when she herself had barely left childhood behind. The midwives who met her at Pembroke knew the truth too well. They had seen girls die under far less strain. They prepared their herbs, their prayers, their knives, not just for the newborn's sake, but in grim readiness for the worst. For Margaret Beaufort, widowhood at 13 was not an ending, but the beginning of a crucible that would shape her into one of the most formidable women in English history. Pembroke Castle was no palace of warmth or splendour. Perched upon a limestone promontory above the dark waters of Milford Haven, it was a fortress built for endurance, not comfort. Its massive round keep rose like a watchful sentinel, scarred by centuries of siege and storm. For Margaret, brought here under Jasper Tudor's protection, it would become both a prison and a crucible. Within these walls, her childhood would end forever. The journey to Pembroke had nearly undone her. At 13, swollen with child and weakened by grief, every jolt of the litter cut through her body like a blade. The Welsh winter showed no mercy. Ice crusted the ground, turning muddy tracks into treacherous ridges. Rivers ran swollen and fast, forcing her attendants to detour for miles. Armed bands roamed the countryside, some loyal to Lancaster, others to York, all dangerous to a vulnerable young widow carrying a prize unborn heir. Each time horsemen appeared on the horizon, the company stiffened with fear. When at last the battered procession clattered through Pembroke's gatehouse relief, must have been tempered with dread. The castle's chambers were as cold as the stone cliffs beneath them. Great fireplaces devoured logs, yet could not chase away the draughts that slithered through every crack. Tapestries were hung against the chill, but still ice rimed the window panes. Margaret's rooms were a far cry from the gentle gardens of her childhood at Bletsoe. Here she lived in a fortress where survival was measured not in comfort, but in endurance. Jasper Tudor, not yet 25, bore the weight of responsibility with a soldier's grim resolve. He was a man seasoned by the shifting loyalties of civil war, yet even he must have faltered at the sight of his brother's widow. A child forced into womanhood, pale and frail, yet determined to live for the sake of her unborn son. Jasper sought counsel from the castle physician Lewis Caerleon, a learned man schooled in Oxford and Paris. But Caerleon's conclusions offered little hope. Margaret's body, he warned, was simply not ready. Her pelvis too narrow, her bones too slight, her frame still growing. To attempt childbirth in such a state was to wrestle with death itself. Yet Margaret was no ordinary girl. Her faith became her armour. She prayed with such fervour in Pembroke's chapel that her knees bled on the stone floor. She recited Latin devotions until her voice cracked, clinging to the belief that her suffering had purpose. In this perhaps lay the root of her lifelong obsession with religion, not merely piety, but survival. When the world around her spun with betrayal and bloodshed, prayer offered a structure that human promises could not. Still, prayer alone could not turn the baby within her womb. As her belly swelled through that brutal winter, Caerleon's anxiety grew sharper. He told Jasper that if fate was unkind, the Tudor line might end before it had even begun. Options were grim: to attempt to shift the child's position, risked killing both mother and infant. To wait was to gamble against time and exhaustion. And a caesarean birth, rarely attempted in those days, was a death sentence for the mother. So they waited, watching the storms lash against Pembroke's walls, watching a girl of 13-inch ever closer to the most dangerous hour of her life. Each day that passed brought dread and anticipation in equal measure, for within the fragile body of Margaret Beaufort lay not only her own survival, but the uncertain future of the Lancastrian cause. January 1457. The wind screamed against the towers of Pembroke Castle, but inside the keep it was another storm that consumed the night. Margaret's labour had begun. She had been walking the battlements following Dr. Lewis Carlion's advice to take exercise when the first crushing pangs tore through her body. By the time her attendants brought her back to her chambers, her face was already ashen, her lips bitten raw in silence. Then the silence broke. The girl's cries carried through the stone halls like a dirge for the living. The midwives moved with practiced efficiency. Herbs were burned: lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, sage to purify the air. Basins of hot water steamed beside linen cloths piled high. Knives, hooks, and forceps gleamed in the firelight, instruments of life and death that no one wished to use, but all knew might be needed. Their leader, Dame Gwen Furch Dafford, had delivered hundreds of children. Yet as she examined Margaret, her brow creased with unease. This was not the body of a woman ready for birth. This was still the body of a child. For hour after hour, Margaret laboured, her screams raw until her voice gave out, leaving only hoarse sobs. She clutched the sheets until her nails tore. Sweat poured down her face, mingling with tears. Each contraction seemed to split her in two, yet the baby remained lodged, unyielding. The midwives whispered to one another when they thought she could not hear. They had seen this before: children forced to bring forth children, their bodies breaking under the ambition of men. Many had not survived. Outside the chamber, Jasper Tudor paced like a caged lion. He could hear her screams through the thick oak door. Every sound was a blade in his chest, yet he could do nothing. Servants rushed past him with fresh linens, their faces grave. Father Meredith, the castle priest, prayed in the chapel without ceasing, calling upon every saint he could name to spare the girl and her unborn child. As the night dragged into dawn, Margaret's strength ebbed. 18 hours had passed. Her skin was pallid, her pulse thready. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking the straw beneath the bed. Dr. Carlion and Dame Gwen spoke in hurried whispers. If nothing was done, both mother and child would be lost. They decided on a desperate measure: manual extraction, a procedure so dangerous it was nearly as feared as the labour itself. The chamber held its breath as Dame Gwen guided her hands inside, praying under her breath to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth. For long minutes, the room was silent, except for Margaret's ragged gasps and the scrape of the fire. Then movement. The child was forced into the world, torn from his mother's body with a rush of blood and effort. At first, there was only silence. The infant lay limp, pale, barely breathing. Margaret, half conscious, strained her eyes toward the bundle. The midwives rubbed his chest, cleared his tiny throat, and then it came a thin, indignant cry, high-pitched and furious, cutting through the stillness. Relief broke over the chamber like a tide. The boy lived. He was christened Henry Tudor, the child who would grow to end a dynasty's war and begin another. But in that moment, he was only a fragile infant laid briefly on his mother's chest before being swept to the hearth. Margaret's eyes locked on him wide with both awe and fear. She was alive but shattered. Her body, torn beyond repair, would never bear another child. Thus, at 13 years old, Margaret Beaufort had fulfilled the cruel bargain of her fate, her youth and her health given up to deliver a son who would one day change the course of England. The echoes of her screams faded into Pembroke stone, but the memory of them would haunt her and define her for the rest of her days. When the cries of the newborn faded into the firelight and Margaret drifted into fevered half-consciousness, the battle for her survival was far from over. For weeks she lay between life and death, racked by infection, her body broken in ways no physician could truly repair. Dr. Caerleon whispered of torn flesh and organs of injuries that left her unable to bear children again. At 13, her womb had already been sacrificed to dynastic ambition. Yet Margaret lived, and so too did her son. That fact alone made her valuable and dangerous in a realm where the Wars of the Roses had only just begun to burn. The boy Henry Tudor was immediately placed under the watchful eye of Jasper. To him, the child was no ordinary infant, but the fragile future of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret, too weak to care for her son fully, could only watch as others swaddled him, bathed him, carried him through the draughty halls of Pembroke. Her relationship with Henry was from the beginning. Shaped by distance, she adored him, but he was not hers to raise. He was England's. Meanwhile, the storm of civil war darkened. The Battle of St. Albans in 1455 had already set York and Lancaster on the path of blood, and the realm teetered between rival claims. For Margaret, widowhood offered no reprieve. Her estates and her lineage made her a target. A young heiress with a Lancastrian son could not remain unprotected. Survival meant remarriage. By 1458, scarcely a year after her harrowing labour, she was wed again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. It was no love match, but it was prudent. Stafford was a man of moderate temperament, inclined toward Yorkist sympathies, yet pragmatic enough to see the value in marrying a Beaufort widow. For Margaret, the union offered security. Her estates would be shielded, her person protected. For Stafford, the marriage offered connection to one of the most prestigious bloodlines in England. Their wedding was modest, a quiet affair, compared to the pageantry of her first. Margaret was still weak, still grieving. But in this second marriage, she began to learn the art of survival through compromise. Stafford did not press her with the demands of her first husband. Instead, he provided stability, a rare commodity in those years when kings were toppled and restored like pieces on a chessboard. Still, her heart remained fixed upon her son. Henry grew under Jasper's care in Wales, surrounded by loyal retainers, and the rhythms of a culture steeped in both poetry and war. Margaret saw him rarely, perhaps once a year, sometimes less. Each parting must have torn her anew, yet she accepted it with grim resolve. Better to be separated and safe than together, and exposed to the wrath of enemies. In the long absences from her child, Margaret turned inward. She studied household accounts, mastered the management of her estates, and deepened her religious devotion. Hours spent on her knees before an altar honed her conviction that suffering was not meaningless, but a test, a fire through which God shaped the chosen. The young girl who had once been pawned off in betrothals was learning the skills of a political player, sharpening her mind while her body healed. As battles raged across England, Margaret Beaufort, still not yet 20, stood at the precarious intersection of motherhood, widowhood, and survival. She was no longer the child screaming in Pembroke's birthing chamber. She was becoming something harder, something forged by pain, a mother who would sacrifice everything, even closeness with her only son, to keep him alive. The years that followed stretched into a cruel lesson in absence. Margaret's son, Henry, grew up not at her side, but under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales. From infancy to boyhood, then boyhood to youth, he lived in the green valleys and stony keeps of the Welsh West, far from his mother's daily gaze. Margaret, bound to her second husband, Henry Stafford, and entangled in the turbulence of English politics, could see him only rarely, brief visits once a year, sometimes even less. Each meeting was fleeting, each parting a renewed wound. For most mothers, separation is a tragedy. For Margaret, it was necessity. In an England divided between York and Lancaster, her son was both a treasure and a target. If enemies of the House of Lancaster learned to see in him a rallying point, his life would be forfeit. So she poured her maternal devotion into letters and gifts, small tokens that travelled the dangerous roads between England and Wales. A finely bound book, a garment stitched with her hand, a message written in her careful script. They were fragments of love reminders that, though distant, his mother's will wrapped around him like invisible armour. In Wales, Henry's education was not only that of a noble heir, but of a survivor. Under Jasper's watch, he learned to ride and hunt, to speak Welsh fluently, to grasp the loyalties of men whose allegiance was not bought by gold, but by respect. He absorbed the rhythms of rural life, of minstrel songs and church bells, of the hard simplicity of a land on the edge of England's control. While princes in London learned the polish of courtly ceremony, Henry was forged in exile within his own country, a boy hardened by uncertainty, his destiny carried on whispers rather than heralds' trumpets. Meanwhile, Margaret's own education deepened. Her marriage to Stafford afforded her not just protection, but experience in managing estates, balancing finances and navigating loyalties in a kingdom torn apart by civil war. She kept accounts like a steward, studied law like a clerk, and prayed like a nun. Her library grew filled with Latin texts, histories, and works of theology. She was fashioning herself into something unusual, a woman of learning, piety, and ruthless practicality. Yet all her studies could not blunt the terrors of war. In 1461 came Towton Palm Sunday, fought in a snowstorm so bitter that men's faces froze to their helms. 50,000 soldiers clashed on that field, and by nightfall nearly half lay dead. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and it ended in decisive victory for the Yorkists. King Henry VI fled into exile while Edward IV claimed the crown. For Margaret, the implications were chilling. The Lancastrian cause, already battered, seemed broken. Every rumour, every courier's report carried dread. Would Edward IV see her son as a threat? Would soldiers march into Wales to drag him from Jasper's protection? Margaret's prayers deepened into obsession. She bribed servants for scraps of news, paid informants to carry whispers from Wales, and cultivated friendships on both sides of the conflict to shield her boy. A single misstep could mean his death. Thus, while other mothers cradled their children by the hearth, Margaret Beaufort lived in a constant state of vigilance. Her love for Henry became not the tender warmth of lullabies, but a weapon sharpened by necessity, cold, fierce, and unrelenting. She would not cradle her son in her arms, but she would cradle his destiny in her hands. The year 1471 shattered what little stability Margaret had clung to. Two great battles, Barnet in April and Tewkesbury in May, snuffed out the last hopes of the Lancastrians. At Tewkesbury, Edward, Prince of Wales, the only son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was slain. Soon after, Henry VI himself perished in the Tower of London of melancholy, according to official word, though many whispered the truth of a dagger in the night. With the Lancastrian line extinguished, eyes turned to a boy in Wales, Henry Tudor, Margaret's son. That dangerous spotlight forced Jasper Tudor into a desperate choice: better exile than execution. In September 1471, he spirited the 14-year-old Henry across the sea bound for Brittany. The crossing was perilous. Storms lashed the Channel. Yorkist patrols hunted the coast, but they made landfall. From that moment, Henry began a 14-year exile on foreign soil. For Margaret, who had already endured years of absence, this separation cut deeper than any before. She had lost not only proximity but certainty. Messages came rarely coded in false names, and invisible inks smuggled through merchants and pilgrims. At times, months passed with no word at all. She could not know if her son was safe or even alive. Grief, however, did not crush her. It hardened her. With her second husband Henry Stafford dead in 1471, Margaret was once again a widow. This time she chose her next marriage not for protection alone, but for power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley. Lord Stanley, one of the shrewdest political survivors in England. Stanley had mastered the art of shifting allegiance at precisely the right moment, a talent that kept him influential while others fell. For Margaret, this alliance was invaluable. Through Stanley, she gained access to networks of soldiers, spies, and court insiders. Together, Margaret and Stanley played a dangerous game. Outwardly, she was a loyal subject to Edward IV, even attending court and exchanging pleasantries with Yorkist nobles. Inwardly, she nurtured her son's claim, weaving threads of conspiracy that stretched from London to Brittany. She bribed clerks for copies of correspondence, paid servants for whispers of royal intentions, and built one of the most sophisticated intelligence webs of her age. Information flowed to her from merchant ships, from abbots in monasteries, from noblewomen exchanging letters under the cover of domestic chatter. She became, in effect, a shadow general of a cause without an army. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, opportunity and danger arrived in the same breath. His heir, the boy Edward V, was seized by his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. By summer, Richard had declared the princes illegitimate, imprisoned them in the Tower, and crowned himself Richard III. The boys were never seen again. Whispers of their murder spread like wildfire, poisoning Richard's legitimacy. For Margaret, it was the moment she had long prepared for. Her son, once a distant claimant, now seemed the only viable alternative to a usurper suspected of killing children. She moved swiftly, conspiring with Bishop John Morton and even with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's widowed queen. The plan was audacious. Henry Tudor would invade from Brittany and marry Elizabeth of York, uniting Lancaster and York in one crown. But plots are fragile things. In October 1483, betrayal unravelled the scheme. Rebels were executed. Margaret herself was spared only through Stanley's intervention. Richard placed her under house arrest. Stripped of titles, her movements watched. Yet even then, she did not yield. From confinement, she continued to plot her pen and her faith her sharpest weapons. To Richard, she was a dangerous woman. To her son, she was the beating heart of an exiled cause. Margaret Beaufort, child bride and shattered mother, had become a strategist whose ambition burned hotter than fear. August 1485. The winds of fortune, which for decades had blown against the Beaufort line, finally shifted. Henry Tudor, now 28, returned from exile, landing at Milford Haven with a small army gathered from France and loyalists who had never abandoned the Lancastrian cause. For 2 weeks, he marched across Wales and into the Midlands, every step carrying him closer to destiny and to Richard III, the king who had seized power through blood and suspicion. On August 22nd, the two armies met near Market Bosworth. The field was heavy with mud, the sky iron grey. Richard commanded thousands armoured knights bristling like a forest of steel. Henry's forces were outnumbered. The outcome on paper was certain the invader would be crushed, but paper had never measured the will of Margaret Beaufort. For years she had spun the web that would catch this moment: her marriage to Thomas Stanley, her careful cultivation of loyalty, her relentless conspiracies carried by secret letters. As the battle raged, Richard charged with ferocity, determined to strike Henry down himself. Chronicles tell of the king spurring his horse into the thick of the fray, cutting his way toward the Tudor banner. For a heartbeat, it seemed the crown would be secured by sheer audacity. Then came betrayal. Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, who had held his troops back, watching and waiting, finally unleashed them. His men swung the tide. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and slain in the mud, fighting to the end with a crown hammered onto his helm. When the dust settled, Henry Tudor was proclaimed king. On Bosworth Field, the Wars of the Roses ended, not with negotiation, but with death and betrayal. Margaret's son, the fragile infant who had nearly killed her in birth, now wore England's crown as Henry VII. The dynasty she had sacrificed everything to secure was born. Margaret's role did not end there. She became My Lady, the King's Mother, a title unique in English history, wielding influence second only to her son. She managed estates advised on marriages, arranged alliances. Her piety grew as her power did. She endowed colleges at Cambridge, supported printing presses, and turned her religious devotion into lasting institutions. But behind the cloisters and chapels was always the iron will of a woman who had gambled everything and won. Yet victory carried a cost. She had lost her childhood to forced marriage, her body to a brutal labour, her motherhood to politics. For decades, she lived separated from her son, able to shape his destiny but not share his youth. By the time Henry VII secured the throne, mother and child were bound more by ambition than by the tender intimacy most families take for granted. It was the price of survival in a kingdom where love was a luxury and lineage a weapon. Margaret Beaufort died in June 1509, just days after witnessing her grandson crowned Henry VIII. In Westminster Abbey, her tomb of black marble bears a Latin inscription praising her piety and devotion. But no inscription can capture the scream of a 13-year-old girl at Pembroke Castle, the sound of a child torn apart to bring forth a king. That cry lost to stone and time was the true beginning of the Tudor Age.